Hi, this is Skip Stewart, Chief Improvement Officer with Baptist Memorial Healthcare. Today we want to speak about continuously improving the various ways that we write obstacles. And we are not implying that there is only one way to write obstacles. We do want to bring clarity to this subject. As you can see on the picture there, we believe that obstacles are really the heart of the matter. That is me there on the left, and on the right is Matt Dane. Matt, if you would, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Dane. I'm the Associate Chief Nursing Officer here at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis.
We're also joined with Brandon Brown, a Master Kata coach. And Brandon, if you would, please introduce yourself.
My name is Brandon Brown, and I work with Skip and Matt as well throughout the Baptist hospital system. I coach Kata within the Baptist management system. Very glad to be here today.
Most of y'all are very familiar with this blue brain. Anytime we do any kind of workshops or training within the Baptist management system, we give out this blue brain. And at the bottom of the blue brain, it implies, or it says, show me your thinking. And what it's implying is that we want good thinking patterns more so than we want tools or techniques. Thousands of you have this card hanging from your badge. The front is blue and the back is black. And this is known as the Coaching Kata card. That third question there is really the question at hand. What obstacles do you think are now preventing you from reaching the target condition? I love this question because it does not say what questions or what obstacles do you know, it's which ones do you think. Many times we discover that the obstacles that we think are in our way are really not true obstacles, and we discover new ones along the way. Here's the 4-step Improvement Kata model that makes up the Baptist management system. And what we're basically saying here is that each step frames the next step. So for example, that first step, understand the direction and the challenge. The challenge is a strategic imperative. It's a game changer. It's something we're trying to achieve more than something we're trying to do. Then we move to step 2, grasp the current condition. Well, we're grasping the current condition in light of the challenge. Then we move to step 3, establish the next target condition. Well, that's in light of our understanding of the current condition, and so on. So each step of the Improvement Kata pattern operates within the context of the previous step. The framing effect is an integral part of effective learning. So what you do in one step frames the next step. The clearer the definition of the challenge, the more appropriate will be your analysis of the current condition. The better your analysis of the current condition, the more precise your definition of the target condition can be. The more precisely you define the target condition, the better and more quickly you can recognize obstacles and iterate towards it with rapid experiments. And clearly writing obstacles will help you write better and more effective experiments, or what we call PDSA, plan, do, study, adjust, ultimately impacting the pattern of work as well as the process and outcome metrics. So once again, the more clarity that you can build into each of these 4 steps, what we call the Improvement Kata steps, the better you can experiment. So there's the 4 steps again. It looks a little different. This is what the journey looks like as we're headed towards a vision. This work comes from the work of Mike Rother in his book Toyota Kata and his research. We've just taken the 4 steps and baptized them. But this is the mental model that makes up the Baptist management system. Step 1, once again, is the challenge. It's a strategic imperative, normally 1 to 3 years out. We tend to put ours 52 weeks out, and it's what we're trying to achieve. It's like if you went into a machine and traveled into the future. What would it look like 52 weeks out? A great challenge from our country's history is when President Kennedy said he would have a man put on the moon and return safely by the end of the decade. It's a great challenge. Why? Because it's verifiable. I can see whether it happened or didn't happen, and it had a date connected to it. Step 2, grasp the current condition. But you can already see that step 1 is framing step 2. So step 2, grasp the current condition. The current condition is more than just a result metric. A result metric in healthcare would be things like HCAP scores and falls and infection rates, or maybe collection rates in the billing department. But it's more than just that. We want to understand the pattern of work. An example of that would be from the sports world. The scoreboard is your result metric, but we want to know how you're playing the game that produces the scoreboard. Then we move to step 3, establish the next target condition. The magic word there is next. It implies there will be multiple target conditions on your way to the challenge. So if our challenge is set out for 52 weeks out, the target condition is typically going to be 2 to 3 weeks out. And what we're doing in the target condition is we're laying out a hypothesis for a new pattern of work that'll move us in the direction of the challenge and maybe even produce a different set of metrics. So that's what that is. That's more of the hypothesis. And then step 4 is once we have been very clear about the obstacles, very specific about them, then we want to experiment through them one at a time, or what we call PDSA, plan, do, study, adjust. A couple quick comments about this model is it's content neutral, meaning I can use it in clinical areas, non-clinical areas. It is also fractal, meaning I can use this model if I'm having a conversation with a CEO, or I can use this model if I'm working with someone in a department, a frontline worker on a problem. It's an iterative process. And finally, this is a meta routine that stays the same regardless of the circumstances. A routine way of acting and thinking. Now in the real world, this model looks a little messier, and this is what it tends to look like in the real world. A couple things to point out here. One that's obvious is you have to experiment your way forward. But look there at the letter A. You cannot reach the overall challenge right away. We're not going to go from number 2 to number 1, just in one swing of the bat. We're not always trying to hit a home run. Look there at the letter B. The path to the target condition is not predictable or straight. See, when we try to only plan our way forward, then we end up relying on our biases. And finally, once again, you have to experiment your way forward. Let's look at this model once again. And you see those green barriers? Those are what we call the thresholds of knowledge. That threshold of knowledge is the point where we have no data, we have no facts, and we're guessing. Thresholds of knowledge are really kind of difficult to spot because we don't realize our brain is automatically filling in our knowledge gaps. We tend to kind of go right through them. The social scientists will call those the learning edge, and that's where we have to run our next experiment.
Skip, if I could add one thing, that knowledge threshold or threshold of knowledge, not a common term that many people use. We just don't come up to Matt Dane and say, hey, what's your threshold of knowledge today? But many times when we look at the obstacle list or we read through the obstacles, it should define for us what we know and don't know about our current condition. And so the clearer we write the obstacles, the clearer that we can identify that threshold of knowledge and know when the learner's there and whether we've written a good experiment.
Great point.
You know, one thing that is interesting to me as I became more involved with Kata thinking is that as healthcare workers, we're all scientists by nature. And experimentation is okay as we grow in our training and in school, but once we get into the real world setting, specifically leadership, we lose the essence of experimentation. We default to our biases. We tend to think we're expected to know the answer to the problems we face, and we lose the opportunity to experiment our way to the next target condition. So this is really at the core of who we are as healthcare providers and scientists.
Great point. One last thing about this before I leave this slide. Remember, this we call this the Improvement Kata model, but it's really not about the model. Like Mike Rother likes to say, it's really how do we operationalize this model? There are lots of models that have been around and continue to get introduced. Models like system thinking and learning organization, creative thinking, preferred futuring, skills of inquiry. It's not about the model, but how do we operationalize the model so that it's part of our behavior and actions. And you're going to see in here in a second that it's really a coach-intensive process. We have to have a coach to operationalize this model. Now, once again, why do we have these thresholds of knowledge? Well, our brain tends to fill in the blanks. See, the brain doesn't necessarily show you unfiltered reality. The brain takes patterns, the brain takes things that you have experienced in the past, the brain takes assumptions we have and fills in the blank. The brain quickly and unconsciously jumps to conclusions. See, our brain creates these feelings of certainty based on the bits of information it receives. So that's why we tend to have these thresholds of knowledge. Remember I told you it was a coach-intensive process? So there's the coaching card. But, not everyone's a coach. Coaching is a skill that you have to learn. It doesn't come by way of a certification or a degree. It's a skill. And these questions are the initial headings. But as you develop that skill, you can ask additional questions in between. I love this quote from Mike Rother. Without coaching, we lose our way and don't practice the right pattern or practice ineffectively. Without coaching, a change in our mindset and our brain's wiring is unlikely to occur. So there's the coach and there's the learner. There's always a coach, there's always a learner. And we're trying many times to move the mindset of where the learner might be at. So let's talk a little bit about mindsets. There's a famous book written by Carol Dweck, professor of psychology at the Stanford. And there's also a pretty good website called trainugly.com that explains some of her work. And I'm going to explain it very briefly. So there's a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And a couple ways to think about that is by thinking of characteristics. So let's deal with the first characteristic of effort. Many times we don't tend to value the importance of putting forth effort. We look at effort as something that's negative, something you have to do when you're not good enough. And that's what a fixed mindset tends to do with the characteristic of effort. But a growth mindset looks at it as an important part of learning. Or how about the characteristic of challenges? Maybe a fixed mindset gives up or checks out quickly versus a growth mindset perseveres and works through them. Mistakes. A fixed mindset hates making them and avoids them at all costs versus the growth mindset treats them as a learning opportunity. And then finally, one more, feedback. Maybe a fixed mindset takes it personal and gets defensive, but the growth mindset likes it and they use it. Now, we're not implying that someone is one or the other. There's a very large spectrum, and you can be a fixed mindset on some days and a growth mindset, or maybe in different categories. But this is many times what the coach is trying to do, is move them from one to the other. As the coach is working with the learner, driving them or helping coach them towards a target condition, a fixed mindset initially is going to want to be in that green area, that apparent certainty area. Remember, these mindsets or attitudes toward learning, that green area is things that we already know how to do, like driving a car, or riding a bike, or sending out an email. That green area, life is really good. It's comfortable, it's familiar, it's predictable, it's easy, there's confidence. We tend to think we already know the solutions, and we get ourselves in a little bit of trouble eventually because we're relying on our biases versus clearly identifying obstacles. See, we derive a lot of sense of security and confidence from that certainty, and we tend to seek it. The way the adult brain functions, we naturally strive to operate in what is called the zone of apparent certainty, that green area there, where things are expected and rational, calculable, logical, risk-free. But the mindset is we tend to always think we know what's going to happen. We have it all planned out. We feel comfortable and we're in control of everything, but everything doesn't always go the way we want. So we need to get into that yellow area, that learning zone.
So Matt, that's really close to what you were saying earlier about as we become professionals, become into leadership positions, you have a tendency to gravitate more toward that green zone and not as much in the yellow zone. So it takes practice, coach practice, deliberate practice to be able to do this well, right?
Correct, absolutely. And it is one of the, as you get into a Kata mindset, it is one of the most difficult elements to learn and grow into. And without that daily practice, you really won't see that growth of getting more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
I loved how you said that. So that yellow area there is that learning zone where things are not always comfortable. See, the problems that we're going to have today and in the future, they're going to come from that yellow zone. In the green zone, life is really good. The yellow zone, it's a little more difficult. In the yellow zone, we tend to have stress and effort and difficulty and unpredictability. But that is where the learning occurs. That's where the new countermeasures and solutions are going to be discovered at. And so we're trying to move from just the green zone to being able to operate in both of those zones. We really want to get folks outside in that yellow zone, what we call that threshold of knowledge. Remember, once again, that's the point where you have no data, no facts, and you're guessing. We don't necessarily want to be in the red zone, that land of mystery, just kind of using a shotgun approach and jumping around from obstacle to obstacle. Social scientists call that threshold of knowledge, that learning edge. And remember, once again, they're difficult to spot because we forget that our brain is automatically filling in the knowledge gaps. So we're trying to go from that fixed mindset. Instead of using the word growth, we use the word adaptive, because we're trying to simultaneously get you to operate both in that green and that yellow area. That yellow is where the learning occurs at. But a lot of times, learners want to, at first, want to only stay in the green zone, only doing go and sees, and we want to get them doing more exploratory type of experiments.
Yes, it seems like that the groups that move faster toward achieving more and more target conditions, or more of the target conditions, or getting closer and closer to the challenge, are the ones that are experimenting at that knowledge threshold. They're doing more exploratory experiments. They're doing testing hypotheses. They're changing the work pattern to try and operate like the target condition describes, as opposed to those that may struggle, have a tendency to stay too long in the go and see. Send an email, run a report, go to a meeting, ask a few more questions. So,
great point. So we want to expand that comfort area. Now, there will be a dilemma in that yellow area. We think we want to make the best plan, and that's a good thing to make plans, but we're going to learn that maybe it wasn't the optimum path, hindsight. And there will be unanticipated obstacles. But we will increase our knowledge and increase our threshold, you could even say, as we experiment forward. Love this quote here from a pretty famous executive coach. He says, a coach recognizes that the internal obstacles are often more daunting than the external ones. You've seen that a lot, Brandon, as you coached.
Definitely.
So real quick, just to go through the card again, most of the questions have a predictive nature to them, or generally speaking, or more of a reflective nature. So we'll go through them quickly. What is the target condition? First question. Second question, in your current condition, what is your actual condition now? What was your last step or your last experiment? What did you expect to happen? What did you expect to see? What did you expect to learn? What actually happened? What did you learn? There's that hard question. What obstacles do you think are now preventing you from reaching the target condition? Which one obstacle are you addressing now? There on number 4, what is your next step or your next experiment? What do you expect to happen? What do you expect to learn? And finally, how quickly can we go and see what we have learned from taking that step? So remember, we're PDSAing against the obstacles. There was a great quote a friend of ours, Beth Carrington, gave us not too long ago. She said, we don't PDSA to achieve the target condition. We PDSA against obstacles. That's really a great comment. See, we're not trying to hit a home run. We're trying to run an experiment against a specific obstacle, which might be one obstacle among many. We're not running around trying to play the whack-a-mole game. These obstacles here in that screen are pretty typical in healthcare. We see that quite often, where you're looking at things like the doctor, the nurses, I'm not operating in the target condition. We want to try to be more specific. When you're vague about everything, you're always happy with whatever you get.
Yes, Skip, this was a very important point and a new concept. You know, traditionally as a healthcare leader, we understand, we think we understand the PDSA cycle, but we traditionally see it, speaking for myself, as I'm PDSAing towards a solution or the goal. So to change my mindset to actually PDSA to expose and uncover more obstacles was really counterintuitive to how I traditionally approach problems. But what I found was, as I focused more on finding the obstacles, we started to get closer to that next target condition.
Great point. Thanks, Matt. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to just run around. We want to be much more intentional. Also, we don't want to embed possible solutions in our obstacles. I know for a fact that both of you have experienced this, where people have put down things on their obstacle parking lot like need more workers, need more equipment.
Need a job instruction, need to re-educate, retrain.
So we're embedding a solution into the obstacle parking lot. So there's the question: what obstacles do you think are now preventing you from reaching the target condition, and which one obstacle are you addressing now? See, when the coach asks that question, she or he is curious about what the learner or the improver believes are the unresolved issues, the sources of variation, the problems that are preventing the process from operating routinely the way it should, defined in the target condition. One of the things that we're trying to do is encourage people to be more specific. But I'll be the first to admit that many times folks will say, well, how do I become more specific? So we want to offer some techniques to that, not implying that these are the only ones. There's the question again. And so this example right here comes from a friend of ours, Mark Rosenthal, that writes a great blog called theleanthinker.com. And here's one example he gives. Here's a test. Complete this sentence. We can describe the target condition because. Following the word because, read the obstacle verbatim. Read exactly what it says on the obstacle parking lot. If that does not make a grammatically coherent statement, then the obstacle probably needs to be more specific. So go back to that. Sorry about that. So we're now going to go over, Brandon's going to go over something that's familiar with most of y'all. If you're watching this video within Baptist, you've taken the dominoes class. So let's use this if we can.
So some examples that I usually see many times, we want to write down a noun or an occurrence as an obstacle. So we'll write topple too soon. We'll write shaky table, domino scatter when dumping. Well, those are really vague. There are a couple of words long. It's hard to define a good PDSA step, and we really can't measure it. How do you measure a shaky table? So we think we're there when we get a little bit more facts and a little bit more data about it. So we work on the obstacle again, and we write the obstacle more descriptive, like we build it halfway and then it topples. Or the table is shaky, and if we bump, then the dominoes topple. Now you're telling me a little more. The action of bumping is actually affecting the working process. Or the dominoes scatter when dumping and fall on the floor. So we're a little closer, but we're not quite there. We're more descriptive of the issue, but it's difficult to define a good PDSA step from here because we still can't measure many of these things. So let's try writing it as maybe using facts, data, and then some negative result, some negative outcome, or writing the obstacle in the form of a question about the facts or data that we don't know. This is so we can learn more about the obstacle to the target condition and promote really a go and see experiment. That's usually where we first start to write an obstacle. So if we try and write, let's writing as facts, data, negative result, or even in the form of a question needing answers for achieving the target condition. Let's change that first one to when we start on the branched areas of the pattern, two workers interfere with the work pattern and we topple before completion. I have facts and data. I know how many times, I know how many workers, and I have the negative result that's causing us the problem with the target condition. How can we measure that? Well, we already have an outcome metric of a topple percentage. And if we have standard work in place, could we audit it to 100%? The second one, we don't know a way to prevent bumping the table and have toppled too soon twice in each of the last two attempts. Again, we have some facts and data or a question needing answered, but we know it's the last two attempts that's happened twice. So maybe a way to measure that would be calling out the occurrence of that happening. We call out bump and count how many times we bump the table. Now we can quantify it and start to think more along the lines of what can I do to PDCA against the obstacle. And the last one, we don't know a way to prevent dominoes from toppling, and at least 5 dominoes fall on the floor. Again, we have a question needing answered. We don't have a method, but we have some facts and data, and we could count the number of dominoes as a way to measure it that fall on the floor each time we dump. The less dominoes we drop on the floor, the closer we are to being able to overcome that obstacle. So again, facts, data, negative result or outcome, or maybe in the form of a question where we need an answer to get closer to the target condition. So some of them that I see here that are dead giveaways that are action item oriented, and we're reverting back to our old habits or our old ways of writing to-do lists, is when I see the verbs like need or make or training. Those are dead giveaways that the learner's resorting to ingrained habits action item lists, and that's really counter to the Kata methodology. That's more like episodic improvement events. So we want to limit verbs in the obstacle parking lot. We don't want to embed solutions with them either. So we want to be looking for those each and every time. Another word are blame. Sometimes we want to blame things. We'll write things such as nurse to patient ratio. Well, that may be facts and they may be information, but they're non-productive exercises and they're not obstacle identification the way the Kata way of thinking should happen. So the Kata coach needs to evaluate the learner's threshold of knowledge. Well, they can't really do that if the words that are on the obstacle list are things like shift change or patient meal times. I mean, unless we're going to adjust the patient meal times, how are we going to change the working pattern and how are we going to increase the threshold of knowledge? So the coach needs to be looking for these things and coaching the learner to be more in lines of writing in the form of a question, or as Skip said, simply say we can't operate in the target condition because, and then read it. And if it sounds like a blame or some action that we can't really overcome, then maybe we need more clarity there. They're more than just statements and phrases. We need to be able to measure them. Statements with a fact without a negative result or a trend or effect on the process metric or causing the gap between the current and target condition, those things are not obstacles. Instrument flags, that's just two words. It's an occurrence. Text getting burned out with the challenge. Abnormal patients, dilutions and lipemia. I mean, these are just everyday occurrences within the healthcare setting. And so they're just statements and phrases. They're not actually ways that we can measure outcomes. And there's even this one here, obstacles we haven't learned about yet. That could be an infinite statement. So we need to really coach around these and really get the learners to think deeper about what's causing this gap between current and target condition. So we've got some ways to improve that. Again, we mentioned the fact, data, negative result way. We mentioned the litmus test of asking the question and filling in the blank. We also talked about questions needing answered. So here we have one with a negative outcome or a question that needs answered. We don't know the ED zones and their relationship in EPIC. We know that patients are waiting and the room cannot have the IV, and this causes IV increases in turnaround time. So any negative outcome or result helps us better define what we are trying to do to operate in the target condition, and it's the obstacle that's causing that particular gap. The main thing is we don't want to write solutions either. The last obstacle here starts out with no TWI job instruction. Well, we're already implying that a job instruction would solve the issue, but we have done a good job with the second half of it, which is to correct IV documentation for new hires or current RNs, which cause fallouts greater than 30 minutes. We've been 19 out of 81 or 24%. That's our current fallout. So I've got some more information here that I can then start to coach toward, and maybe a job instruction is a countermeasure to it. Maybe there's another method that we want to use. But we at least identify the facts, data, and what the current outcomes are causing. That indicates how we can measure the obstacle. And many times when we start to look at these measurements of obstacles, they actually become the process metrics that we want to keep measuring throughout that target condition.
So just a quick comment here. The reason I threw this one up is, Brandon talked a minute ago about, putting it in the form of a question about the facts and data that we don't know. And these next 5 examples came from Lori, a respiratory therapist director at DeSoto, and this is how she started off. But before I go there, we were having a conversation, me and Brandon and Beth and Mike Rother, and I was really asking, why is it that so many people are vague about writing the obstacles? And he made a great comment, Mike Rother. He said, well, there's a little bit of a mental dilemma. He said, sometimes people fear saying they don't know. And I said, well, yeah, what if we were to get them to say, I don't know yet? And then he went on to say, well, what if we even get them to say, I don't know, and I need to go back and study the current conditions some more? And then he went on to tell me about people say I don't know because, or they don't say I don't know because there's a level of fear. And so instead of saying I don't know, they just put something vague. That way they're not kind of exposed. Beth Carrington had a good comment. She said she likes to ask, what do I need to know? And the answer is the obstacle. The lack of knowing is the obstacle. So here's a couple examples of how Lori first started off before she went into the facts, data, and negative outcome. So these were examples from a couple years ago. We don't know the best time to coordinate a spontaneous breathing trial with the nurse and doctor. So the question, what is the best time to coordinate the spontaneous breathing trial with the nurse and doctor? We don't understand the RASS scale. What is the RASS scale and how can we teach it to RTs? We don't have enough input and information from case management. How can we get more information from the case manager? We don't have a useful report for identifying admitted COPD patients. Can BOC create a useful report to help us identify admitted COPD patients? And finally, we don't have enough appointment slots for our pulmonary rehab classes. How can we create more appointment slots for our pulmonary rehab classes? So that was just an example she gave us, and she's evolved to the facts, data, and negative outcome.
So here we're going to be coaching for improved obstacle identification. These are real obstacles that we have had written on obstacle parking lots, and we moved them more after coaching to more fact, data, negative outcome, or some information that we need to know more about the current condition. The first one there is not entering patients into teletracking decreases the percent of patients by transport staff. Well, that's a pretty good start, but after we coached it for a while, we found out that, well, it's the RN staff not following the target condition discharge process, and that decreases the likelihood that the discharge process will be followed correctly. Therefore, the percent of patients presented to transport staff decreases, and the bed status will not automatically change from dirty to signal EDS to clean. How can we measure that? Well, we could start to measure the percent that's presented to transport staff and the percent of walkouts and discharges by the nursing staff. So then we can quantify that and actually start to measure that as a process measure.
A second example would be IV placement documentation increases the order to the begin time. Nothing to measure there, nothing to compare it to. A lot missing from that obstacle. So after some coaching on that obstacle, what we don't know is the time frame given to RNs regarding IV placement and documentation time. Therefore, we cannot determine if the MD's orders for the IV for the CTs first, or if the MD enters all orders in a batch, which could delay the time the RN is given to place the actual IV, ultimately delaying the order to begin time. And then how can we measure that? Well, we can manually compare patient by patient the percentage that were batch MD orders versus single orders using the order to the begin report. Another example would be RNs difficult to find or reach. Very vague, doesn't tell me anything about what that might cause, what negative impact that might have on the environment. So some additional coaching needed there. So obstacle after additional coaching, radiology does not know who in the ED to notify for patient location, and readiness, which increases the order to begin time. So how can we measure that? Well, we can track the number of times radiology calls and cannot get an RN on the phone. Example 4, why does it take so long to get an HCG? Good question, not a negative impact there. Additionally, doesn't tell me a whole lot about the impact to the environment and what that may cause. So after coaching, is the process for determining HCG and orders with contrast causing the delay, or is it delayed because an order has never been placed by the MD until after radiology asked for the HCG? This increases the order to begin time. Very well written, and after a little coaching, you can understand the true impact and the question that they're trying to ask. And how can it be measured? We will review times manually from order to begin reports filtered for HCG orders. And another example here, ensure while we are inconsistent with CHG, BAS, or pericare. Again, very vague, no negative impact to the environment. So after coaching, we are ensure while we are inconsistent with CHG, BAS. Some patients have been documented as getting 2 baths in a day, tells us a little bit more about the situation, while others have none, which results in poor quality of patient care, so I've got negative impact tied to it, and we are not in 100% compliance with policy, and this increases our risk of quality. So now I can fully understand the negative impact to the environment that this obstacle is causing. And a way to measure it, daily CHG bath percentage compliance with policy, utilizing a daily run chart.
So here's one that obstacles many times with a method of measurement actually can create that new process metric that I was talking about. Here we have facts and data, and the result on the target condition, the process metric being negatively affected, is identified. But when we first started coaching this, the obstacle was written as communicating ready patient from pivot desk to preventing the team in the back from pulling their patients, which is causing an increase in arrival to room. So the learner on this particular one wrote, how will we measure that? Well, they picked a couple of process metrics that were already out there. Arrival to room was already being measured, and the admit and discharge length of stay were being measured. So we already had that. But when we started coaching a little bit deeper and said, we're already measuring those things, what is it exactly that we're trying to measure? And as we started to look at that, we started to look at actually it's the communication that's happening or not happening. It's the process metric of percent of patients pulled versus those that are pushed or not able to be brought back in patient flow, continue to flow. It's the communication that's the pain point, not necessarily that we're wanting to measure the existing process metrics. So we started measuring a percent of patients pulled as the next process metric.
So one of the things that we do here, I just want to bring attention that we have a little tool called the Dreyfus model, to where we try to look at the skill level of learners and coaches and second coaches. Now, these are not labels. We're not labeling people as a novice or someone as proficient. But you can see that anytime you go to a class or you go to college, you get a certification, you're a novice at best. You don't really develop skills until you get out in the real world. You make mistakes and you learn from those. So we go from novice to advanced beginner, competent, proficient, and Dreyfus calls our highest level expert. I'm not a big fan of that word, so we call it eternal learner. But you can see that the steps upon the process is not even. And so we just wanted you to be aware that this is the case. And so Brandon's going to review now, how does a novice write obstacles versus an advanced beginner?
So many times the characteristic of a novice learner is that their obstacles are written really in a couple of different forms. The obstacles identified are actually actions or solutions instead of a true obstacle. As far as articulating the obstacle, they're usually articulated as vague obstacles, and they can't really be experimented against. And then documenting them, the learner usually forgets to update the obstacle list, or as the PDSA progresses, they don't identify clearly which obstacle is being addressed. Many times I'll see an obstacle parking lot that has 8 or 9 obstacles written out, and we're 6 to 7 days into the target condition, and they haven't marked up or added to anything to that obstacle on the parking lot. Also, the relationship between the obstacle and the target condition. Obstacles do not link to the target condition in the PDCA, so that connection, that linkage, where we're trying to identify that gap is not clear. So I'll see the novice learner turn away from the storyboard and start to explain as they start to talk about the obstacles. So anytime a coach sees a learner turn away from the board and talk for about 2 minutes, we lose all of that information. And most of the time, the learner is the most passionate and knowledgeable about that particular obstacle when they're turning away from the board. So usually as a coach, I'll give a tip of a nonverbal tip. Just have a pen or pencil ready and say, hey, could you turn around and add that information? What you're saying there sounds pretty important about the obstacle. As we start to move to advanced beginner, as far as identifying obstacles, Obstacles are really more observed instead of word of mouth. I've actually seen it. I've done a go and see, and now I'm starting to progress maybe to an exploratory experiment. I'm able to articulate obstacles a little better. They're becoming more specific. They may not articulate how they can be measured, so how we will measure that box may not be filled out. But sometimes they're not written as facts and data as negative outcome on a metric or the working pattern, or they're not written in the form of the question or many of the other ways that we've talked about writing obstacles. Documenting the obstacle on the obstacle parking lot is updated as PDCA progresses only sometimes, and usually the coach has to nudge them along to say, that obstacle's changed a little bit. We've learned a little bit more about that. Let's rewrite it. And then the relationship between the obstacle and the target condition, specific and crisp obstacles that are clearly linked to the target condition. The advanced beginner starts to see that as they progress in skill. So I'll see advanced beginners sometimes start to turn away to explain, but many times they catch themselves already, or they're easily redirected and start writing what they're saying. In other words, they usually already have the pencil or pen in hand, and they've already started marking up the obstacle or marking up their PDSA as a result of what they're learning as they're talking out their thinking. As we move on up to competent level and the drive for skill model, obstacles that are identified are observed and discovered during the PDSAs. Some of the best learners that I've ever coached are the ones that understand that through the PDCA process, I'm out to find as many true obstacles as I can find. I'm not necessarily trying to solve it in one big step of the PDSA. I'm trying to find and observe more obstacles that are more true and real. As far as articulating obstacles, they're very specific. They can be articulated and measured and eliminated if possible. They're usually well written in the manner in which we've talked about, facts, data, some negative outcome, or what's the metric it's affecting, or in the form of a question so that we need to do a go and see, much as what Skip said about Lori. What do we need to find out? Documenting the obstacles. The learner is usually actively looking at the obstacles during the observation of their PDSA cycle, and they're learning with reflection. They're taking notes. So they may come back to the obstacle parking lot with a sheet full of notes before they start to write out the obstacle. And the relationship between the obstacle and the target condition is strongly connected. You can see the linkage there between the target condition and the PDCA. And if we eliminate that obstacle, it directly ties to the results of achieving and getting to that target condition. If we eliminate that obstacle. So some characteristics that I see competent learners do are usually adding detail as they are reading the obstacle, because their metacognitive habit has already started to kick in, and they are continually adding, and their thinking pattern is dynamic. In other words, as they read the obstacle aloud, they start to work out their thinking and realize, hey, there's more information that I could add here. I also learned this, and they'll start writing on the obstacle parking lot. Some of the best ones that I've seen are ones that are written in red ink, blue ink, green ink, pencil. They've been marked up. I know that they're actively working that obstacle parking lot. It's not been written out at the beginning and then never touched again throughout the target condition period.
So once again, the issue that we want to continue to emphasize is that any of these skills is something you have to practice deliberately. There's a picture of Brandon for those that don't know him. Good looking guy, isn't he? And that is Mike Rother right in the middle. And so just to kind of close this out, we really just wanted to bring attention to this very important subject of how to write obstacles. Hopefully you find this is helpful. And I know me and Matt, we just want to thank Brandon. I have learned a tremendous amount from you, Brandon, about this subject. And we hopefully this will be helpful to everyone watching the video. Thank you so much.